Thank you for asking. I completely forgot. We will record. I just pushed the button.
Awesome. Cool. Well, let me first share my screen and then get my slides going. This is going to be kind of a mix of a little bit of PowerPoint and mostly demo, hopefully. Let me know when you can see my screen.
We can see it.
Excellent. Okay, so like I mentioned earlier, I'm going to be talking about unpivoting and then visualizing Likerts, so transforming data from Microsoft Forms. And this was something that I discovered a need for and got very excited about, just the concept of unpivoting, and asked Shannon if this was worth sharing, and she said it was. So blame her if you find this dull and boring. So I work for Chemonics International. We are an implementing partner in the international development industry. We use Microsoft for most of our global workforce infrastructure, and so that includes Power BI, but it also means Microsoft Forms. And as I mentioned earlier, my name is Matt. I'm Director of Data Quality and Governance there. And part of my job is to push Power BI adoption to the Chemonics global workforce. It's absolutely my favorite part of the job. And so I'm starting with kind of an excerpt and adaptation from one of the trainings that we developed internally, but then I made some changes to it this morning. So if anything goes wrong, that's why. I just want to start by defining Power Query, because it has become my favorite part of Power BI, actually way more than the data visualization. So the way Microsoft defines Power Query is the data connectivity and data preparation technology that enables business owners to seamlessly access data stored in hundreds of data sources, but then the even more fun part, reshaping it to fit their needs with an easy-to-use, engaging, and no-code user interface. And unpivoting is really about reshaping data. So what I'm talking mostly about is Microsoft Forms. So I don't know if anybody has ever had occasion to build a form. This thing here, this is called, oops, wrong button. This is called a Likert scale. And so you have a series of statements and then a series of options that you can select for any given statement. And it tends to be kind of repetitive. And it's a lovely thing. And within Microsoft Forms, there's great out-of-the-box visualizations for it. And, this bar chart that shows, here's, the topic of data validation and what my training respondents thought about it, whether or not it was too simplistic, already had some familiarity, or are still confused. Kind of centers around a zero axis and leans to one side or the other based on how people respond. But when you export this data into Excel, you get this thing down at the bottom, which is really annoying, right? So each of the options that you ask about becomes a column, and then you have this, really difficult table. And there are lots of threads out there in the Power BI community of people trying to figure out, what do I do with this, and how do I kind of make this usable in a Power BI context? So unpivoting, I have learned, is the key to making this a more Power BI friendly data set. And just to talk briefly about what unpivoting is, so pivot tables, most of you are probably familiar with Excel pivot tables, which summarize repetitive data. You feed it something that is highly duplicative, and then the pivot table organizes the information into a table and summarizes. And so we're using kind of the technical definition of summarization, where in Power BI summarizations can include count distinct, min, max, average, and whatever. So pivot tables in Excel can multiply, they can add, they can count things. But unpivoting is taking data that's already in this kind of summarized format and unsummarizing it. So what you end up with is highly repetitive data. So I invented this law of conservation of data. So if you've got a Likert survey with 9 columns and 15 rows of data, what you really have is 135 values. So that's your data set inside this. So you've got 15 15 rows times 9 columns equals 135 cells worth of data. And when you unpivot it, you end up with 135 rows, each of which has one value, and then you have the attribute repeated over and over and over again. So data validation shows up here, and then this is one person's worth of survey, and then data validation and the second person's worth of survey, and so on from there. So the data is conserved. You still have 135 rows, but the 9 column headers become 9 distinct attribute labels, and then everything gets repeated 15 times. And when you do this in Power BI, you by default get a column heading called attribute and a column heading called value. So is this something that you need? I don't know, it depends on your job. I have found this super helpful in the monitoring, evaluation, and learning context, learning and development practitioners, anybody who's trying to make sense of survey data. For me, thinking of unpivoting as collapsing columns into rows was the way that it first made sense to my brain. But really the key is that Power Query makes it super easy. So for this demo, I'm going to be using an Excel export from Microsoft Forms. It's saved to my desktop. And you know, the Likert data, like I showed in the screenshot earlier, is in a few columns of this. And let me switch over now into a demo. So I'm here in Power BI. I'm going to open up Power Query, and the Excel file was just sitting on my desktop. And so connecting to it's super easy. I always pick the table if I have the option, and I'm going to jump right into Power Query and transform the data. And so I guess I have 16 rows of data now instead of the 15 that I started with. And you know, I've got my ID here. This is my survey respondent, the start and end time of their survey. All of the other questions that they answered, like how likely are they to recommend my training to somebody else. But then we get into the Likert scale. And so the question there is, you know, how was the training for teaching these concepts, data validation, delimiters, data dimensions, and so on? And people give their answers, and it's in these slightly obnoxious columns. So in Power Query, I'm just selecting the first one of these, moving down to the last part of the Likert table. And then unpivoting is here in the transform ribbon, and unpivoting the columns is the feature that I want. And I'm going to pick unpivot only selected columns. So I picked the data that I wanted. Depending on what your data looks like, you might want to pivot other columns apart from what you've selected, but I'm going to unpivot these selected columns. And so what we get, like I talked about earlier, is this attribute value pair. And so I already showed a screenshot of this, but you can see how user respondent one's question or information that was not unpivoted is simply duplicated. So now I have this highly duplicative data set here that when I look back here at the ID of my respondent, you know, I've got 9 rows for respondent 6, 9 rows for respondent 7, and so on. And my next, or my number one favorite feature of Power Query actually is choose columns, where I can filter out all the things that I don't want to think about. And when unpivoting Likert data, I always want to hold on to that ID, because later we're going to take this data set and we're going to tie it back to the rest of the data. But I'm going to take my attribute and value pairs, grab those. So now all I have is my Likert information. And because this is my Likert information, I'm going to call this Likert info. So I'm just renaming my query Likert info, and I'm going to change this to Likert statement, and then this to survey response. And that'll just help me make sense out of the data. So this is something that, because it's highly repetitive, I can now theoretically do some kind of visualization with it. I just jettisoned all the rest of my data, though. So one of my other favorite features of Power Query, and I'm sorry, I'm going to catch up on my notes here so that I can make sure that I hit all of the points that I want to talk about. So because I just jettisoned the data, I want to bring that data back. And one thing that blew my mind when learning about Power Query is the idea of just duplicating a query. And so I'm going to call this raw survey. And this isn't the raw survey, right? This is my Likert data, but applied steps, which baffled the hell out of me when I first started using Power Query, until I learned to think of it as a time machine, where I can go back in time. I can go back to like before I did anything and see exactly what my data looked like. And so I'm going to get rid of all of these unpivoting steps, because what I want is my raw survey data. And the info that I have unpivoted, all of these other things, I actually don't need anymore. So in this version of my query, I'm going to choose columns. I'm going to take out all of the things that I unpivoted, drop those, and so now I've got my raw survey minus Likert. And so now I've got two different queries out of the same Excel data file that still have a shared key in this ID. And so now when I close and apply this to Power BI and load my tables, Power BI is pretty savvy about catching that these two tables are related. So if I go into my data model, Power BI was smart enough to detect the relationship between the two ID fields. And so now, even though it's in two tables, I can treat it as if it were one table, because that's just very basic data modeling. Let's see here. Okay, so visualizing Likerts. So let me jump back into Power BI. This is something that I needed to do recently. We did a big survey out to our entire organization to find out how ready people were to reopen given the COVID-19 situation, and to assess how people were doing in the work-at-home environment. And so I had learned this and got lots of opportunity to practice it. But I realized I wanted to actually, it wasn't enough just to like academically unpivot the data. I had to visualize the data. So the Microsoft Forms visuals out of the box are very, very pretty, but and it's super easy to gauge responses here, but this is not easy or simple to do in Power BI. There's no out-of-the-box visualization that lets you do this. There are some ideas floating around out there on User Voice if you want to try to vote them up. And I like went through the entire marketplace trying to see if there was anything that I could possibly use, but I couldn't find anything. So what I ended up doing instead was a kind of straightforward sequence of transformations. I'm actually going to jump over into a different Power BI project. So this is what I ended up with. But let me walk through the Power Query for this. So these particular questions were based around fairly traditional Likert responses, right? Strongly agree, neither agree nor disagree, disagree and strongly disagree. And so the first step was to create a numeric version of this. And for that, I just added a conditional column. You'll see my conditional column looks weird because I cheated and did a new column from examples. And, you know, so these were the first two things that I saw was strongly agree and neither agree nor disagree. But by setting up a numeric value that corresponds with each of my Likert items, I can now do math on it, which is what Power BI needs to do in order to do any sort of bar visualization, other than just count. And count is not exactly what I'm looking for my purposes. So by equating strongly agree to 2, strongly disagree to -2, and then centering around neither agree nor disagree at 0, I got numerical values for each of these. And then I did this for each of my Likert tables that was relevant, and ended up just kind of copying the same thing over and over into, or I ended up copying the same query and then just pointing it at a couple of different attributes by mucking around with what I was, which columns I was choosing. And then ended up with a table that I could actually slice. So my data model has my raw minus Likerts table in the center, and then all of my different Likerts hovering around it, all linked together by the ID. And what that lets me do is put some slicers here that are based on the overall survey, and I sanitized this a little bit so that I could share it, but I had our staff level, you know, whether they're an associate, director, manager, or other, and then they had rated themselves on how effectively they were working at home. And I started out with some filtered data, but like on the whole, our workforce is doing a pretty good job working at home, right? If they're talking about their effectiveness, their focus, their sense of privacy, their systems access and stuff, everybody pretty strongly agrees with, you know, the statements that we've got, and that was great. One of the things that we were trying to figure out was, you know, how ready are people to come home? And we had a question basically saying, how ready are you to come home? But we were also asking, how effective are you at working at home? And people would self-assess that. And two of the questions were a little more negative. So I've had to fundamentally revise how I do my work in order to work at home effectively, or I would be able to fulfill my job functions much more effectively if I were in the office full time. And when I looked at just those, it was kind of interesting. You know, I can actually slice and dice my Likerts here to see how these pieces relate, because as pretty as the Microsoft Forms visualization is, you can't actually do this kind of analysis on it, looking at subpopulations of the data. So what was really interesting is that the people who were struggling mainly around focus. They still had very good systems access. They still felt pretty effective, but they were having a hard time focusing, isolating themselves from distractions, especially compared to the rest of the population. They were also an extreme minority. They were 29 out of our population of 916 responses. So anyway, so those were some insights that I'm able to give. To actually build this Likert visualization, though, or this Likert-like visualization, there were a couple of little tweaks that I had to do to the bar chart. So for one thing, I was using the focus question here as my axis. I was using the average of the focus response numeric value. So that's what I actually pulled in. So when I strongly agree equals 2, this is just the average bar. And although it doesn't show exactly who said strongly agree, who said neither agree nor disagree, the average still puts the weight of the bar in about the same place. And it, you know, gives a very clear sense of what's going on. But then I realized that that Power BI, in its eternal quest to be helpful, was being unhelpful because it was dynamically adjusting the axis, which made it hard to put these 4 Likerts next to each other. It also was warping the size of the bars relative to each other. So in the formatting pane, I went into the x-axis and constrained the start to -2 and the end to 2. So if you had 7 Likert statements, you would probably go -3 to 3, or, you know, whatever makes sense for the way that you had to numericize your data. But you want your start to be your minimum and your end to be your max. And then so that then only gives a numeric label to the axis. So to get this -2 strongly disagree, neither agree nor disagree, I then had to go down and manually add an axis title that had a bunch of underscores, because I tried putting spaces and Power BI just ignored them and trimmed them out. And so I was not able to get the title to pad out. So I had to use kind of unattractive underscores, but it gets the gist across, so that if somebody's coming into this not remembering or not knowing how the original survey was structured, it tells you pretty clearly strongly agree versus strongly disagree. And Yeah, that's really kind of it. So just to recap, unpivoting is a beautiful feature. It consolidates columns into lots and lots of rows while conserving the data. Duplicating queries allows you to create multiple tables off of a single data source, and then each of those tables can be transformed independently. So if you've got a big survey with a dozen Likert questions, you'll probably want to create a separate table for each Likert. But then you always want to make sure you keep that key column so that in between your duplicated queries, you can still build the relationship. And then adding conditional columns makes the Likert options into something numeric that you can use to build an average. And then building out bar charts with constrained scales allow you to visualize those average values around a zero axis and get an experience that more or less mimics what you get in the Microsoft Forms visualization. So, any questions?
That was amazing. There were so many little tips and tricks that you dropped in there while you were going through your process. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that was awesome. I just have two comments. One is that I actually had to use Unpivot the other day for some financial data. So it was a combination of transpose and Unpivot, and they saved my life. So you can use it for finance as well. And then the last one is to get everybody excited. I know you touched on Microsoft Forms. In October, we're hoping to have the Forms Pro product manager from Microsoft, Wally, join us. So he'll be talking a bit more about Forms Pro, which is changing the name, but I don't think I'm allowed to say it yet. So thank you, Matt.
Cool. Glad I could segue.
I see a hand in the chat. Fernando, did you have a question?
Yes. Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Well, I have a question. I don't know exactly how was structured your quiz or your questionnaire, but imagine that you have a question where you find demographics of the people there. For example, even easy as female or male. Mm-hmm. How do you incorporate these demographics in your analysis?
Sure. So the demographics stay on that raw table. So here my raw minus Likerts. This gives some. This is where all of those demographics landed. So the email of the respondent, the ID, the person's name, their division, their level, where they had worked. Any question basically that wasn't a Likert, that was just a simple multiple choice question, just stays on the raw table. And then anything like that can be used to build out a demographic question, right? So we weren't asking heavy duty demographics like, you know, your age range or whatever, because we were going out of our way to try to make this as anonymous as possible. But anything like this that boils down to, you know, one sliceable value sits on that raw table, is linked to all of the different Likerts through the data model, and then allows you to use it as a slicer. So, you know, it's kind of interesting to see the different dynamics of the 10th floor versus the second floor, and, you know, which of them are doing better. A lot of that is because where you work correlates a lot to like what division you work in, right? Who your senior vice president is. And, you know, part of what we hope to do with the survey was to gauge which of our divisions were thriving in the work at home, or, you know, taking care of themselves, because we had some other questions about well-being that I sanitized out of this. But you know, we wanted to be able to say, you know, this division is doing really, really well. This division is kind of struggling. What's the division doing that's doing really, really well that the division that's struggling could potentially learn from? So those kinds of demographics, just by being in the data model, by staying on that raw table, are accessible as slicers.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Thanks so much. Anybody else with any questions, or has anyone else done this kind of analysis but like slightly different and maybe has any reactions to Matt's presentation?
I have a question. This is Ben.
Hello, Ben.
Hey. My question is, since you were kind of just building this from the ground up, being that you couldn't find anything out there, how long would you say this will take somebody who has a fairly good knowledge of unpivoting?
So I was able to build the entire report. So there was this plus several other pages. This only took me about 2 hours. It was really not hard to do, and especially once I had sat down and had gone through, because this is all Power Query. Pulling out the data is all Power Query. And so if I've got my raw table here that has all of my, raw data sources, all I need to do is duplicate, or actually even faster than that. Let me delete this. So if I want to go into like, oop, did not mean to make that reference. I don't know what that was. Okay, so here's my, sorry, I clicked on the wrong thing. So if I've got my focus thing, if I duplicate it, so now I've got my whole history here. Really, all I need to do is switch into my removed other columns and find, instead of these 3 things that had to do with focus, I can look for, the things that dealt with well-being, right? How are my team dynamics or whatever, my supervisor's taken reasonable steps or whatever. I can pull that out. It's all still the same kind of information. I still need to unpivot this. So unpivoting the other columns, because I started just with the ID and the other information, it was super quick to do that. The columns I renamed, but this is now team dynamic, and oops, and response. And then added my additional column. Oh, okay. Well, this just needs a tweak because this is looking for a column that doesn't exist. So no, not privacy question response. If response equals, 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 and all the values are still the same. Select that. I might want to clear out any empties, or remove empty is a little bit more fail-safe. And now here I've got my team dynamics. And as soon as I close and apply this and bring it into my data model, because the IDs, it's the same column from the same data source, Power BI automatically builds the connection in my data model. And boom, here are my team dynamics questions, and I can, actually just, I think I was just literally copy pasting these Likert tables and then just swapping out the items that were in them because it was already set for average and the question. So it went very, very, very quickly.
Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. I also think you get major bonus points for demoing on the fly there. That's awesome.
Yeah, that's great.
Thank you so much. Anybody else have any questions or comments for Matt? All righty. Matt, thank you so much. That was super informative. I was taking screenshots and tweeting them the whole time. Hopefully some other folks can learn from that. And like you mentioned, we'll be sure to post the video afterwards. Thank you.
Absolutely.
All right. So now we will pass the ball over to Z. who is our next and final demo. We're doing a little bit of a different format tonight, 2 shorter demos instead of 1 long presentation. So Z, do you want to take it away?
Sure, sounds good. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
All right,
Yep.
let me share my screen here. Okay, let me know if you can see my screen.
Yeah, we can.
All right, so this is a, I would say, fairly short demo. Let me just a little bit background by myself. I'm director of business intelligence at Data Engineer. I lead a small team of BI engineers and data engineers to deploy, I guess, solutions using Power BI. And recently, I think with the release of, not recently, I guess, with the Dataflow being released sometime back, we're trying to migrate our current data set to use the Dataflow for better efficiencies and then more features. And we run into a few, I guess, issues or challenges around, how Dataflow interacts with Dataset. And for this demo, I want to share kind of the process came up with to help schedule the refresh of the dataset after the Dataflow updates. So if you have used Dataflow before or currently, you know that Dataflow is actually a pretty good service. It helps you to separate your M queries from the dataset. So you can focus on writing all your complex data processing steps in the Dataflow and keep your DAX computations in the dataset. However, as of right now, there isn't I would say, a way to schedule the dataset to refresh right after Dataflow finishes. So you can stagger the refresh between the Dataflow and dataset, but you kind of have to watch out to make sure that the dataset only refreshes after the Dataflow completes. Of course, you have other options here, such as using web API calls for both the data flow as well as the data set. And you can use Power Automate, which is a feature I think that came out maybe months or so back that allows you to use Power Automate to refresh a data set. But still, you still have to kind of figure out how to do the web API calls and work with your administrators to set up a different process. So it's one more thing for you to monitor to make sure it doesn't fail. So if you have a lot of stuff that's going on, you probably don't want to kind of worry about, okay, did my data set refresh after the data flow, etc. So for this demo I mentioned, we come up with this process that you can refresh the data set after the data flow completes without creating a web API or the need to kind of stagger the refresh. So let's take a look what this process looks like. So right here, we have the data flow, which is essentially pulling back from the data from your data source. We schedule this refresh every 30 minutes or based on whatever the frequency your source data updates. Then instead of having a data set that directly connects to it, we also create another data set that refreshes every 30 minutes. It's a very small data set. It essentially just checks your data flow to see if a new data arrived. So we could just call this refresh checker. And this data set also reference a SharePoint list to track all the refresh histories over time. So you don't have to use the SharePoint list. You can use Excel or even a database to kind of store your refresh history or your batch all the batch processes. So once this checker detects that a data flow has been refreshed, this will use a dashboard to trigger a Power Automate flow, which in turn refresh your actual data set, the report data set. So the benefit of this is you don't have to refresh. I mean, you eliminate the chances of refreshing your data set while the data flow is refreshing. And also for this process, you do not have to write any code, or you'll work with admin to provision a Power BI app where you have to write the code to create that kind of the web API calls. And lastly, by using this process, by refreshing this, call it refresh checker data set, you reduce the load on the Power BI services, or potentially also reduce the load on the data source. So this one is a really quick query that's just pinging the data flow to see, do I have the new data? Do I have the new data? So it doesn't have to pull all the data into the data set. So I'm going to jump into the demo to see what they look like in Power BI. So before going to the Power BI, so I created let's call it a fact table. This is a fake data I'm using a SharePoint list here. So there can be a fact table. So I'm just using it here to store 8 different transactions from different customers. And within the let's also create a Power BI refresh history. This one, every time the refresh happens, I'll insert a record here to let you know when the refresh happened and what is the latest data date that were refreshed into the Power BI dataset. So with this two lists set up, let's go back to Power BI here. So I have the fact table. This is the data flow, a very simple data flow right here. It points to the SharePoint list I created, pulling in 8 records for right now. So if you have not used the data flow before, it's essentially a Power Query service that's in the cloud. So you cannot define any metrics, but you can define all the mQuery steps within the data flow. Okay, and you have all the different options that you have within the data transformation options on the desktop. So I'll just cancel right here. So now I have the data flow here, putting in my fact table. So I schedule this one to run every hour or whatever the frequency your source data updates. So I also have our report data set. So the report data set is pointing to the fact table. But this data set has now been scheduled. Instead, I create a very simple data set called refresh check. So let's take a look at what that data set looks like. Go to the edit here. So this refresh checker data set looks at the fact table, which is your data flow, and also it has a connection to the SharePoint list, which contains your refresh history. So it reads the table, tells you when was the last time the data was refreshed, what's the latest data in both the data set as well as the data flow. And this alert here is a difference between the data that were refreshed in the data set and the latest data inside your fact table, which is the data flow. And right now it's a 0 because I just refreshed it last night. So this way, the reason I'm creating a KPI visual here is within Power BI, there are only a few visuals that supports alerting, and that's what I'm going to use to trigger the Power Automate. So let me exit out here. Okay, so we have the report created to kind of use the refresh checker to pull the information from the SharePoint list as well as the data flow. From there, I'll create a refresh alert dashboard. So this is just pinning the KPI visual right here. And from here, I set up a alert. Data refresh above the threshold. When it's greater than 0, that means you have a new data within your data flow to alert you every hour and send you an email. Turn this on right here. So now we have the Power BI set up. So let's take a look at the data flow itself. So I have some runs while testing this process. So this is a fairly simple data flow. Let me add it right here. So this is a I'll call it a connector where it allows you to refresh a data set. However, it only works for data set, so you cannot refresh a data flow from the Power Automate. So this is the alert ID I set up earlier, which is data refresh. You can set up multiple alerts to trigger this. So for this one, I'm just going to select the dataset refresh alert. And once you do that, so when the alert triggers, it will trigger this data flow. which in turn, I'm going to trigger my actual report data set to refresh. And once that finishes, this data flow is also responsible to update my SharePoint list to increment my my refresh history to make sure that I know that, hey, I have refreshed my data set with new data. So this process can be in SharePoint list, or it could be any other, let's call it, storage solutions that you have to store your refresh history. So they figure out what is the latest value from your data set and the data flow. They create an item here within your SharePoint list, within the list name. What is the refresh process? What's the time, and what's the maximum date that were refreshed? And then finally, it will kind of just kick off the refresh checker again to make sure it takes in the latest data from the SharePoint list, and then send you a notification to say, hey, my data has been refreshed. Now you can use your report now. So let's go back and test this out. So just one caveat I want to point out. I think there's a limitation in terms of how many refresh you can kick off within a 24 hours period. So I think while testing this process last night, I think I kicked off one too many times. So this process might fail just given that I went over the limit over the past 24 hours. So let's see if this works here. So I'm going to my fact table, just pretending that I'm inserting a brand new data. So 7, say 20, 2020, user ID 1, 55, job. So now you have new data inside your call it data warehouse. So within Power BI, so the data flow, the fact table itself is on a scheduled refresh. So I'm just going to refresh it right here instead of waiting for it. So this process should take under a minute just to refresh from the SharePoint list here. So while that's doing that, just I have a report created called report using Dataflow. This is just pointing you to the actual report data set. So right now I only have 8 records here. So if you remember in the past, I just inserted a new record, number 9 here. So it's still pointing to kind of the stale actual report data set. Let's go back. So the fact table has been the fact table data flow has been refreshed. So instead of refreshing the report data set, the refresh checker is set up to run every 30 minutes or to essentially check the fact table. And this is a very lightweight data set. So let me just refresh this real quick. It's still waiting for the schedule. Did it refresh? 725. It just did. Okay. So let's come here. There you go. So I just got an email notification actually saying the data set has been kicked off. So let me pull up right here. So as soon as insert a new data, refresh a data checker, it kicks off the data flow, which in turn, that kicks off the Power Automate, in turn kicked off my data set refresh. So if I go back here to my data set right here, as you can see, this data set has just been refreshed. Oh, that's interesting. How come I didn't update it? I wonder if there's an error message from my data flow here. Ah, there you go. So it did kick off the Power Automated flow. However, I ran into the same issue where I exceeded the limit for my 24 hours refresh. That's why it never kicked off the actual refresh of the data set. But I guess once I pass the 24 hours limit, this way the process here will kick off the report data set refreshes instead of have to schedule it, and your final report will get updated. And the one thing to point out is, if you go to the report data set here, as you can see, if using this process, your schedule type is no longer scheduled, instead of code on demand, because this is triggered by the Power Automate. So in summary, I think using this process, the benefit is we avoided refreshing the actual report data set, which can be quite heavy. And also, we are only going to refresh it when the fact table gets updated. So this saves a lot of headache for us in terms of managing our existing reporting process.
This is really, really neat. Z.
Z, could you put that slide deck up again?
Yep.
Of the entire solution? Cool.
Yes.
Thank you.
So any questions about, I guess, any of the little components we have in here?
How did you, I mean, did you just come up with this out of necessity?
Yes. So we explored different options. One is to, let me go back to the slide. We explored the web API calls and trying to trigger the refresh after kind of our ETL job finishes. But then we run into the issue with we have to work with our enterprise IT team to create an application registered within the, I guess, the Power Platform.
Yeah.
It was a very long process. We have to fill a lot of forms, do a lot of justifications, and so we instead start exploring what other options we have.
This is really amazing. I don't know if anyone on your team has told you how amazing it is, but this is really useful for a lot of people, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's really creative.
So one thing I want to point out here, if for folks on the call who had used Dataflow or who are using Dataflow today, the reason I'm saying is it reduce the data source load is within the Dataflow, we are creating kind of multiple data flows. One to kind of capture the historical data, and one for the current data. And the historical data, once the data flow runs, we essentially stop refreshing it, and it will stay there. And you can always reference them, link all the data flow together using the linked entities. So every time when kind of the refresh happens, it will only refresh kind of the current data, which is month-to-date data. So you no longer have to refresh your historical data. In the past, if we have to use a data set, I know we have the incremental data refresh capability for Dataset, but we did run into issue where once you turn on the incremental data refresh for your Dataset, it's not very reliable when you actually download it to desktop. You essentially lose the ability to edit the Dataset.
Oh, I did not know that.
So that's one reason we kind of went with the data flow, just to speed up our refresh and reduce the load on the database.
Are there any other comments, questions from anybody else? Is everyone just so in awe that they're speechless?
Have you guys worked with data flows before, or? Anybody, any comments?
Hello. Hey.
Hi there, we can hear you.
Hey, this is Ikina. I was just wondering, I was curious. So I'm setting up a flow, or trying to set up a flow similar to pull information from a SharePoint location. And what they're doing right now is kind of manually entering in updates to Excel sheets that are hosted. I'm trying to set up a flow but I'm not sure what the limitations are in terms of like permission access that I would need to actually build the flow within their tenant, deploy it onto the multiple users' accounts. Do you know, like from a permissions perspective, like the different things you need to have set up before you start building these out at scale?
I see Jamie coming out. I think he's probably better equipped to this because for me, we're all internal, so I don't have any issues around permissions.
Well, Power Automate operates a little differently than Power Apps. Power Automate, it's really the person who creates the flow in Power Automate. It's their permissions or that account's permissions that matter. So whatever that account can access is what that flow can do. So if you're creating the account and you have permissions to access that spreadsheet, you can use that spreadsheet as a data source, and then you can perform actions on that data source using that account. The biggest tip I would give you is to create a server's account if you're going to be creating flows that you're going to be handing off to other people. If it's going to be, run in your organization at an enterprise level, if it's not just for like a small group of people, if it's for like a large group of people, that way, if you move on, the flow doesn't die. The flow will keep running because it's tied to the account.
Okay, no, thanks. I definitely appreciate it. And that is the use case. Right now, it's for about 2 to 3 people within the organization, and what they want me to do is develop something internally for them without me having an actual user account within their organization. And so that's why I was trying to see what the different permissions, I guess, levels were we need. Okay.
When we're consulting with clients, we always tell them we'll need a service account, and we build using the service account. That's what we do for everything. Power Apps, Power Automate, but especially Power Automate. It's really important that it's owned by an account that's not tied to a real person.
Okay. Absolutely. All right. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Good question. Any other questions about any other pieces of that solution or just other pieces of the Power Platform in general?
Yes, I have a question, please.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. Hi. So I just started to use Dataflow and Datasets. So I created a data flow of a calendar. And in that calendar, of course, some columns I use the sort by other columns. So for example, you sort the names of the months by a month number so that they sort in the right sequence. But then I noticed when I used that data flow of the calendar in other data sets, the sort by column settings evaporate, go away. I can recreate them or put them back in the new data set. But I was wondering if anybody else has noticed that or experienced that, or is it just maybe something I'm doing wrong?
Mm-hmm. You're talking about sorting the columns, right? The sorting of the columns in the data set.
Correct. So if you create a data flow and then Power Query, you create a column that's the date, then another column that's the month name, and another column that's maybe the quarter name, and so on and so on. When you exit Power Query, you can then choose to sort different columns by other columns.
Right.
And it seems like when I then use that calendar data set in another data set, or when I use it when I create it in a data flow, but then use it with other data flows to create a data set, that somehow those sort by columns just evaporate. They just go away. They're no longer there.
Yeah. The
Is that
the sort that you mentioned on the data set that lives in the data set. So that's specific to the data set. I think I know the setting you're talking about. That's not like it's not part of the transformer data option. It's just kind of part of let's call it the data view within the data set.
Yes, exactly. It's not done inside Power Query with M. You're correct.
So that lives outside of Dataflow. So every time if you have a new data set, you have to do the sorting there.
I was kind of afraid of that, but not life or death, but just a pain in the neck.
Yeah, and the way I would say not to get around it, the way to help with that situation is usually if you have a lot of people using the report, you will create a data set that points to the data flow, but that data set where you set up all the DAX and metrics as well as the sorting, the model, then you create all the report by establishing a live connection to that data set. So this way you don't have to, I guess, mess around with the data set after that.
Yeah. So again, in my example is I was trying to create a data flow of a calendar table that I could use in multiple data sets.
Yeah.
With whatever fiscal periods and so on and so on. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Well, so I have just one thought. This is Shannon, just jumping in. Reza, who presented, I guess, when was that? Just last month, has a couple of good blog posts about using doing exactly what you're trying to do, using Dataflow to create a data table for multiple models. So I'm going to find the link and drop it into the comments of the meetup meeting.
Okay. All right, thank you, Shannon.
But I see what you're trying to do, and there is a solution for it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, of course. I'll drop that in the chat just now. Not in the chat, in the meetup comments. There we
go. And I'm sorry, who was the presenter that discussed that?
Reza Rad.
Oh, yes. Yep, I'm familiar. Yep.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah, but I'll make sure to link to that exact blog post because he tackled this exact question.
Okay, great. Thank you for your help.
Of course. That's what this is for. It's slightly less fun to help people solve their problems when you can't be sitting next to them, but we'll take what we can get.
Yes. Okay.
I have a question. This is Ben again.
Go ahead.
Hey, so this is almost related to the question that's just been asked, but really it just deals with one aspect of the platform. So I use some data that's originally provided to me in Excel spreadsheets, but these Excel spreadsheets also have data in different tabs, and I get them on a weekly basis. So the problem that I see is that when I run the report, it takes a long time to refresh. I think because of the perhaps because of the transformations that it has to go through. And then at the same time, it's reading all the way back to the beginning of the historical data. And my worry or my thought has been to try and figure out how I can improve or speed up the process, or even to just kind of create some kind of maybe list, because right now I do have access to SharePoint, but I'm not using it yet because it's just something we got recently. Just to set up a SharePoint list, or maybe even a data set at this point if I've not started using a SharePoint list. I'm trying to just figure out how this can be done and how I can be able to maybe reduce the time between when I get the data and do all the transformation and then curating the final dashboards and the reports on the analysis. either of the presenters can help with this answer.
Ben, you mentioned you are using Dataflow, or you're not?
Well, at this time, I'm not using Dataflow. It's going to be part of the process somewhere down the line, but it's just basically all Power BI at this point, with the transformations being done in the background for the raw data, and then doing the dashboard.
Is the issue the data input or the output? I'm wasn't clear on that. Or
the issue is when getting the final output, it takes longer than necessary. I mean, I've seen people using data that is thousands of rows, and it takes like just a couple seconds to refresh. But because this one has to go and do the transformation from the Excel spreadsheets from each tab, and then create a flat file, and then run through the history, even though we only need maybe the most recent data to do our analysis, which could run to the current month. It goes to refresh everything from prior years.
So it sounds like the issue is the data, the underlying data.
Correct.
Okay. So you guys probably want to investigate your options as far as how, if there's a better way to store your data than using Excel. Is that something your organization can look into? Is that something that you think your users would be willing to change? And not everyone's willing to change.
At this point, I'm really responsible for the whole initiative. And in order for me to make any kind of recommendation, I have to have an idea of what that recommendation looks like.
Okay. All right.
Yep.
Well, I mean, I would say start with finding the best data source that your organization is willing to pay for, and that you'll be much happier that way. At the end of the day, we always recommend at our company CDS. CDS first is the way to go as far as data, but your company may be different. They just announced today a brand new. I don't know how many people are involved in this particular data that you're building the solution for, but if it's a small group of people, they're going to be rolling out a new data source called Dataflex, which will be available to teams and to use in teams. That's just announced it today though, so you know it's not even available for preview yet. So that's something that might be an option. The advantage of that is that it's a true relational database. So unlike SharePoint lists, which are basically just bona fide Excel spreadsheets in the cloud. But if you have to choose between Excel or SharePoint, I would pick SharePoint. You'll be happier in the long run if you have to choose between the two. If that's your only two choices at your organization.
Then if you have the option to recommend, I guess in the meantime, right, if before you procure a true database, we had similar issue what you're describing. We have an Excel feed that comes in, we have to source it. Dataflow helped in that sense is we have historical data, which when the file arrives, essentially we take the data flow, we stripped out, we have a kind of historical data in one of the data flow. And another data flow, right off the bat, we stripped out all the previous data, just eliminate those rows, then start processing kind of the new data. Then we tie those two data flows together in a single data flow just by doing a linked entity. So this way, then you have the data set looking at that data flow. We found that data flow, at least from this process, runs much faster than the data set. And given that you don't have to schedule the refresh of the historical data anymore, and make it even faster.
Okay.
But yeah,
so how do you go about creating a historical data set, just in a nutshell?
Let me see if I can share my screen. So I'm going to pull up something we did for work. I'll give you some ideas. It may not
Okay.
apply for your instance, but this is one way we found to make it easier for development purpose. So if you see here, we have a bunch of data flows here. We have something called historical. This is our historical. I think our Power BI services is at capacity right now because everyone's refreshing. So this one just runs once, and we store all the historical data, and we set up this thing one time. And once this is done, we have a current version. So the current one, we have a time parameter in there that essentially just say, hey, don't even look at anything that's more than whatever it is. And this current one, also we create a kind of a linked entity here. The little lightning bolt is linking to this one. So you only refresh this thing once. This is just say, hey, what's the max state of your current data? So you have this 2 data flow here. Then we'll have a final one called fact. This is our data flow that we actually use within our data set. As you can see here, I'm pulling in the linked entity from my the current and historical. I have my actual other stuff I need to create here. And this one, when we process it, this historical one has already been processed, so it never refreshes. So it's pretty fast. They essentially just read it in here. And the current one, go get the current one, so that's fine. All the linked one essentially reference one of them, so it doesn't actually trigger a refresh to the source. So we're pushing all the computation to the Power BI. And if I kick off like one of the current one, you can see right here it's actually running. The historic one doesn't run. Whenever this particular current one refresh, all the linked ones actually get kicked off. So for us at least, it helps to reduce the load on the system, and it's pretty fast when the service is not overwhelmed.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Z. Thanks, Jamie. Anybody else questions? Anything you're dealing with? We are coming up on the hour, so feel free to drop off if you have to. We really appreciate the fact that you spent any portion of your evening with us, as opposed to your families or your dinner or whatever it is that you're missing. So thank you. I think I'm going to stick on the line for a little bit longer. Does anyone have any other questions or comments before we kind of wrap up?
I have a question that's not to do with anything that was presented today. Is that okay? Okay, so recently we had to create a new database and based from our old database. And the only way that I found to update all of my Power BI reports is to go into each one in desktop and republish them after I've changed the data source there. Was there an easier way to do that?
I have a response to this. I'm not curious how other people would handle this, but you could set up your data source as a parameter, and then you can change those parameters in the service, but you would still have to change them one by one. Okay. Guys, is there a better way to do that? There's got to be some sort of a hacky way where you can create a table with your parameters in it and then point to that somehow. There must be a way. Does anybody know?
No, unfortunately, I haven't run into that issue.
You're very lucky.
The issue, unfortunately.
Yeah, the issue with us is that our CMS is part of our database, and we got hit by a vulnerability, so we had to build a whole new website, and it was 3.5 weeks of hell, but okay. And part of that was also then updating all of our reports and such, and between the SSRS reports and the Power BI reports, it's been a challenge.
That's a good one, Doe. I'll try to research a little bit more.
I have one additional thought, but this is a very uninformed thought, but other people on the line are more informed than me, so perhaps we can come to this conclusion together. Is that something you could do in an external tool like Tabular Editor or something? Keith, I remember talking to you about this before, and I had no answer then, and I still have no answer.
Okay, I didn't realize I had asked that before. Okay.
I think you and I chatted about it at one point, or maybe actually it was someone else, but I definitely remember thinking this through and wondering if there was a way to do it. And I mean, I feel this way for everything in Power BI, like there must be, question mark?
How are you connecting to it? Is it like an ODBC string that you embedded in your data set?
Basically, yeah, I had connected through when I created them originally, I went in and created get a data set and connected through the SQL connector in Power BI.
I see. For us, we have database switches as well. I think we got lucky is we don't have SQL Server as a data source. So if you look at our queries within Power BI, they're all started with a blank query. We're using essentially ODBC connection. We would have just source equal to ODBC dot query, whatever it is, then DSN equal to whatever the string is. And even when we database switch, essentially we're just say, okay, we're not going to change our ODBC name. The ODBC is just going to point to something different. So we don't have to change any of our data set. We just essentially just say, change our ODBC string to point to something else on the service.
That probably would have been the smarter way to do it, but I was learning and creating at the same time. So I did it the way that looked the easiest at that time. So
that is how I feel about everything I build. I'm with you.
It's like I got into the job and 2 weeks into it, they say, oh, here, you have to transfer all these dashboards from this other system into Power BI. Oh, okay, you can learn on the job.
All right. So unfortunately, that was not a success, but it could be in the future. I do think if you were to use parameters or if you were to use the ODBC connection that Z mentioned for next time, and if anyone else is running across that problem, I think the nice part about this is that we do all have the same problems eventually. So
where do we continue, like, between this and our next meeting, where do we continue kind of chatting about these things? Is that typically done on the meetup group or?
You know, Tammy, we don't really have a good process for that at all. People do make comments in the meetup group. We message each other often, but I don't have a good answer to that. Does anybody have a suggestion?
Twitter, perhaps, Shannon, like the.
Yeah, we do a lot of tweeting with each other and a lot of DMs. I know, Tammy, we're connected on Twitter, but I don't really know. I do think it would be nice though if we could create a little like, it's hard to create something on a Microsoft platform without us having, a tenant or something like that, but there's got to be a way that we could create some kind of a shared space to keep this conversation going.
You can always LinkedIn. We can do a LinkedIn group.
Oh, okay.
That's a good idea.
So if you do a LinkedIn group, is it public or can you do whatever you want?
I have not tried. Just throwing it out there.
Doesn't the Power BI user group have aren't we part of the bigger user group, which they use a system called Higher Logic, which is a community platform?
Yes, actually, Keith, wonderful. So are you referring to the Power Platform UG.com platform or the community.powerbi.com platform? I guess those are two places where we could.
Probably the the second one probably.
Okay, so I'll just share my screen real quick just because you mentioned it and I was looking something up on here. So the Power BI community is usually where I go when I'm looking for answers. But in this case, there are different threads where you can ask questions. And then there is also the dynamic communities chat board as well. But I think we as a group use that one much less often.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I would know how to find this group on there.
Okay, let me show you just one quick way to find us.
Okay.
Although the only way that it works is if everybody uses it, and we're not quite there yet, but maybe we should push for it. I'm going to just share my screen again. Oh, destination unknown.
But I think, yeah, I mean, Shanna, just looking at the Power BI, oh, not Power BI, just LinkedIn group, it seems pretty simple to do. I'm not trying to, get away from the official, the pub group stuff. It just, the interface is not as easy compared to some other tools out there.
That's a nice way to say it. Yeah, so if you navigate to the user group here, so you can get there by going to pbiusergroup.com or powerplatformug.com. And then there is this Power BI DC official group, but full disclosure, we don't use it that frequently. It looks like people have reached out and none of us have responded. Z, Rocio, and I were on here a year ago, but there hasn't been much activity since then. I think a LinkedIn group is a good idea. My only hesitation is maintaining it.
I could help with that.
That would be awesome.
What would be good is at least 2 people, I think, so there's backup. So if anybody else wants to volunteer.
Sure, create one, and we can share that group with everyone.
Okay, sounds good.
I have to turn on my video because this is so exciting. Thanks, Tammy and Z. This is cool. This is going to be great. I think we could potentially have a broader reach too. I don't know who we're going to intend this to be used by, but LinkedIn is used by everybody. So cool.
I have a question, Shannon.
Yeah, go ahead.
I have a Power BI dataset and report where it was connected to SQL Server database, and the client got hacked. He lost all his information, and that happened at the beginning of February. So that means that what we have in the Power BI report and dataset was saved, but they built a new database. Is there an easy way to use that dataset in a new report which is connected to a new server, to a new database that doesn't have 2019 information, to try to combine it?
So as far as having the information stored in the service, it's there, right? But getting it written back to a data set, to a database wouldn't be possible. But you could connect a data model to it using a composite model. Z?
Sorry, you're trying to grab the data from the data set and write it back to the database? Is that what you're trying to do?
No. To a new report, to a new Power BI report. because what I'm reporting now is 2020, but it's empty after before that. But it's there in the old Power BI report.
Oh, so you have two data set. One data set is 2020, one data set is 2019.
Yes, but then the server doesn't exist anymore from 2019.
But you have the data set, right?
Yes, it's there and it's very nice.
Okay, so you have the PBIX file.
Yes.
Yeah, I think Shannon mentioned the composite model. When that comes, I think my understanding is you can do a direct connect to data set. I could be wrong, but that would solve the problem you're facing.
Okay, I will take a look on composite models then.
And the second question I have is, you're not trying to get the data set data out, right? You're just saying you want to use all the metrics and the DAX that's already been created in the data set.
Well, not only the measures, but just for example, if I report sales year to date, I want previous year sales year to date.
Right, so it's the data too.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, that is tricky. Again, I feel like with everything in Power BI, there's got to be a way. I could think potentially of a one-off way that you could, oh, it would be really messy. What I'm thinking of, how big is the data? How big is the data that you're working with? Would it be too big to like use R to get it out of Power BI?
No, it could be managed.
You can dump the data out of writing a paginate report pointing to it.
Yeah, that would work. So you could use a paginated report to get the data out. You could also use R to write it to a CSV. But the problem with using R would be that you're only going to get the data in the tables itself. You're not going to get any of the rest of the model. Z, when you do it with the paginated report, what would you get then?
The data as well. My question, I guess I have a question is, your new data set and your old data set, the new report and old report, if you extract the data from the old report, can you extract them? If you extract them and load it into where your current 2020 data server, database is, would you be able to use the new report to report off both 19 and 20 data?
Well, that I'm not sure because they have an ERP, which is SAP Business One, and I don't want to mess with that.
Got it. Yeah, so if you want to get the data out, paginate report is an easy way to do that because you point to it, you essentially see everything, and you just create a big paginate report, dump all the data out. But I don't think that doesn't sound like that will help you in this instance.
Okay, I'm going to give it a try also. Thank you. It's a mess, no?
Yeah, it's a conundrum. As far as I know, the composite reports, the new feature of composite reports won't be available until at least November. I think they may actually be pushing it back a little bit. So that's not on like the near-term horizons, just in case you were looking forward to that.
And then it's worthless because we changed turn year, and they said previous year will be this year.
Oh, right. Yep.
Okay. Well, thank you. I will check.
Sorry about that.
Yes, it's difficult.
It is. Yes. That's a bad situation too, getting hacked.
And greetings from Puebla, Mexico.
You're calling in from Puebla, Mexico right now?
Yes.
Wow. That's awesome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting.
So cool. All right, guys. Well, with that happy note that we have another one of our global meetings, why don't we go ahead and wrap up? This has been, as always, amazing, really wonderful discussion. Gives me all the warm fuzzies. Thank you guys so much for joining. Rocio, Z, do you guys have anything you wanted to announce or say before we wrap up?
No, nothing. Thank you, everyone. This was great.
Yep, thank you, everyone. And we'll create the LinkedIn group, and I think probably send out the post it in the meetup so everyone can access.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Wonderful. And Tammy and Z, if you guys need any help with that or whatever, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to work on it with you guys too.
Yeah, and I'm happy to help you guys as well. No problem.
Thank you.
Cool. Thanks so much, guys. Everybody have a wonderful night wherever in the world that you are, and we'll talk to you guys soon.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.